For classical Marxism, the conflict that underlies all others is class conflict. The role of knowledge is to organize reality in such a way as to allow for intervention within it. It's a different understanding of the role of knowledge. In Marxism, we observe a reflection on how we read the problem of history and its evolution, on how we understand the focus that mobilizes the development of society over time. Marxism has a fundamentally materialistic and conflicting understanding of this process. Societies change and transform. After a certain moment, the environment starts to generate pressure on this way of living. Resources start to become scarce. The pressure generated by scarcity forces a transformation from an organizational and technological point of view. Something needs to happen of a disruptive nature that will force society to reorganize itself in a way that allows it to produce more. This new magnitude of production is what will allow society to continue growing. In this, we have new forces at work and new power relations that will rule society until those power relations are exhausted for a host of other reasons. We have the consolidation of a model of society that demands conflict within this reality. A condition of stability changes into a condition of instability and then evolves towards overcoming that model at some point. In addition to the cyclical character, we also have an evolutionary character. Because technology and productivity must always be growing, the population becomes ever larger and the resources consumed on an ever greater scale. Thus, the threat of scarcity becomes ever present. Marks the practically insoluble contradiction between the division of labor, the degree of productivity, and the degree of expropriation produced by it. In early hunter-gatherer societies, their ability to be autonomous within a given territory was very limited. The technology they had at their disposal allowed them to enjoy the resources within the environment in which they were inserted, but they had little autonomy since they would run out of resources and needed to migrate in another direction. As we did not have a sedentary lifestyle, for example, it was not necessary to have a very sophisticated division of labor, so it was a limited society in the sense of its ability to extract its resources from nature. As society becomes sedentary, and we have many groups in which organizations are needed to control them and to control and distribute production, it begins to have groups with increasingly strategic roles in the distribution of resources than others. We have much greater production capacity and stronger hierarchies. In order to reorganize society and to drastically increase the productive capacity, it is necessary to reorganize society in a way in which there must be more distribution and more equality. So when we have a technological transformation, even if the guy who benefits very little from the system starts to gain more, the overall context shows that he is actually gaining less considering the whole. For Marxist thought, this is a contradiction which is fundamental to understanding how human societies evolve. We have a problem of scarcity, struggle for resources, and only with something of a geographical or technological nature, something that radically changes production capacities in that society, can we reach a new level of reorganization. This new level is necessarily more unequal than the previous one. That means that the guy who's in the bottom layer is getting less than before. For Marx, in the modern world, we have some important aspects. We have a brutal technological transformation unprecedented by the Industrial Revolution. Through the pressure exerted by the transformations that society has undergone, we have a set of changes that will allow you to transform your production capacity on a scale never seen before. We have a dialectical relationship between the increase in the scale of production and an increase in the expropriation that transformation requires to account for that increase in production. Here the problem of history joins the political problem in the context in which Marx lived. For him, capitalism generates a different opportunity. Capitalism is different because technological transformation it brings is so different from what was seen before. It can be the beginning of the end of this very dialectic, since scarcity is something that human beings had to invent over time. Capitalism has generated something extraordinary in its devastation process. It has generated the possibility of a mode of production so effective from the point of view of its exploitation of nature that for the first time we have the possibility of having a technology that allows men to produce more of what you need to survive. For Marx, this is the first revolutionary thing. That's why capitalism is different from everything else. It is this line of reasoning that differentiates Marx from the socialist thought that already existed, the utopian socialist thought. Marx's idea is that there is something in the type of rupture that capitalism provided in the 19th century, with the transformations produced in the Second Industrial Revolution, which generates a condition that rupture is something different from all previous ruptures. All previous disruptions were marked by the premise of scarcity. society. The transformation that capitalism brings changes man's ability to produce through nature and expropriate nature's products for his benefit in a way that you can transcend the problem of scarcity. Industrial revolution allowed man to produce to a degree that if you properly distribute what you can produce, you don't need to have hunger in the world. That is why capitalism is revolutionary. If we look at the first part of the Communist Manifesto, we see that it starts out counterintuitively because there is a praise for capitalism. This is related to the political possibility, but there is a cost to be paid for this transformation, since there will be a high increase in your production capacity. Once the possibility is in place, the revolution against capitalism could be the last revolution, because the revolt against capitalism would allow the appropriation of a world where a technology with the potential to transcend the entire problem of scarcity is already installed, which is the problem that generates the dialectic itself. Therefore, we observe the problem of history, in which to understand history, it is necessary to understand the conflict that marks the divisions within society, and the polarization of this conflict is identified in the way that society organizes itself to produce. Within this organization, we have groups with more strategic roles in production than others, and therefore appropriate more resources. Thus, the struggle that generates the dynamics of history and that makes societies grow, go into crisis, break up, and generate possibilities of social organization over time is marked by the possibility of scarcity, by the disruptive role of technology, and by this conflict between greater productivity and greater expropriation. To produce more, it is necessary to have a world with even more brutal inequality than before. Marxism sees a unique opportunity for human societies as there is a new phase of capitalism in which industrial revolution generates a production capacity so superior in scale that it creates a possibility of transcending the problem of scarcity. Given the economic growth of the 19th century, it was necessary to expand to avoid an overproduction crisis. Thus, they seek to achieve expansion beyond borders. In this, the colonial project serves the dynamics in which capital is lent to industries so that they can find new markets and maintain the growth cycle. In this process, capital and capitalists are internationalized. Why is this important to Marx? From the standpoint of the political struggle, this is something that workers have failed to understand. A transnational capitalism cannot be faced by a national workers' movement, because the bourgeois elite of your country knows that once it is in danger, the elites of other countries will perceive the possibility of a revolution in your country as a threat to capitalism in theirs. In the context of the end of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, the Germans invaded Paris and the Parisian elite quickly surrendered. However, the Parisian proletariat didn't surrender. They began to build barricades around the city, mobilizing to defend Paris from German invasion. This is a historical lesson, since at that moment, the defeated Parisian elite, instead of joining the French proletariat's war effort, joins the German elite to destroy the war effort of the Paris proletariat that was formed in that context. Marx seeks to show that the main confrontation is not between France and Germany, but between a bourgeoisie that is already transnationalized at that moment and a working class that needs to transnationalize itself in order to survive. Why would workers unite? Because the bourgeoisie had been united for a long time. This is the 19th century historical lesson that must be learned by the proletariat to transform intentions into effective political action. The revolutionary strategy for classical Marxism involves an internationalization of the labor movement. The role of the First International was to coordinate the activities of labor movements to oppose capital that is already transnationalized. What is the political strategy that derives from this understanding of reality? It is to organize these workers for a context of cyclical crisis, to appropriate this instability and foment the revolution. This would happen at the same time in different countries to try to destabilize capitalism and revolutionize the system. This was the plan of the International and failed during the context of the First World War. So what happened in the First World War? The international labor movement is influenced by Marx's vision of how they should operate. An opportunity presents itself to them. The kind of crisis they expected from the point of view of the unsustainable character of capitalism is present in the crisis of the First World War. This would be the time for the international working men to unite. However, this does not happen. The international dissolves because the labor movements of the countries decide to join the war efforts of their nations. For example, the French working class didn't recognize that its enemy was the bourgeoisie. They decided instead to join the French army to fight Germany. Here Marxism comes under sharp criticism from the point of view that it failed to understand how strong is the kind of mobilizing capacity that nationalism was able to produce within communities. This generates a fundamental lesson. An analysis that Marx carried out since the Paris Commune was an artificial perception of what the state is. In classical Marxism, the state fulfills three fundamental roles: defend capitalism internally. The tendency of the capitalist is to fight for individual interests. When resources are scarce, it can do damage that can compromise the viability of the system as a whole. One of the fundamental functions of the state is to intervene at this time to manage conflicts of interest between capitalists. In a given moment, the interest of the capitalist may be going against the interest of capitalism as a system. Thus, one of the fundamental functions of the state is to intervene to regulate the relationship between capitalists so that they do not destroy capitalism as a system, and to defend capitalism externally. For example, the state can go to war to defend the international interests of corporations that are central to the stability of its power. Finally, the state has a fundamental role in the power project of the capitalist elites as it divides the proletariat through nationalism. By fulfilling this ideological role, it stops the working class from fighting against capitalism. In the second phase, we have Lenin's theory of imperialism. We have the context of Russia's exit from the war, the creation of the Soviet Union in 1921. The theory of imperialism initially shows that the contradiction generated in the context of the First War, we have a new conflict between the great imperialist powers, which are the oppressors of this system, and the colonial spaces where this imperialist force projects itself, destroying the nature of the social and political ties previously established in those places. Imperialist forces bring capitalism in order to destroy what existed before and revolutionize the way people organize and produce. It is in this dynamic that a new conflict and the new dialectic of capitalism are installed. By understanding this dynamic, we can rethink a power strategy capable of understanding the contradictions of this new moment of capitalism and developing a strategy to overcome capitalism through these new contradictions. Therefore, imperialism has a central role. The struggle is no longer between the transnational labor movement and a transnational industrial banking bourgeoisie, and is now understood as a struggle between the imperialist countries and the countries oppressed by them. Here we have a conflict between the oppressors and the oppressed. We also have the notion that Russia is the weak link in the imperialist chain, and therefore as the main potential vanguard force within this new power strategy. The idea of a weak link is important, since Marxist thought is evolutionary. There is a relationship between the degree of development of capitalism and the potential for overcoming the capitalism itself. For Marx, this is important because the revolution must start where the transformations arising from capitalism are strongest, such as France and England. So what happened from the 20th century onwards? We have the revolutions in Russia and China, for example, which are not the centers of capitalism. At the time of these revolutions, these countries were fundamentally agrarian. The places where revolutions materialized, unlike what Marx imagined, were countries where the bourgeoisie was weak and the agrarian world had not yet dissolved. That is, the process of the development of capitalism was not yet complete. For Lenin, this is not exactly a problem, as it required a country that was strong enough to be imperialist, but also fragile enough to undergo the revolutionary process. So we have the idea of a weak link. Russia would be the weak link between the countries. When Russia starts to participate in this revolutionary process, it serves as the vanguard of this project, but it's weakened by the kind of hegemony in the US after the Second World War. Why is World War II relevant in this regard? Second World War breaks something fundamental to capitalism. Even in the 19th century, British hegemony had a very high price to be maintained, as extreme poverty was produced so that production model could be kept standing. 20th century capitalism post-Second World War is a moment when we have the combination of an unprecedented degree of productivity of American capitalism with a deliberate policy of income distribution and welfare. This weakened the socialist movement, as it removed the kind of contradiction that this movement fed on to transform the understanding of reality into a strategy for political action. This is important to understand, as classical Marxism needs this connection between understanding reality and the strategy of intervening in reality. For Marx, it makes no sense to separate these two things. This separation is linked to a contemporary way of looking at the problem of knowledge. This puts Marxism in a different dilemma that it had previously faced. In this, capitalism manages to increase production production and distribute wealth. We also have another impediment. From a certain point in the Cold War, with people fleeing the Soviet Union, the brutality mainly of the Stalinist regime began to become blatant for the Marxist intellectual community in Europe and made it difficult for the academy engaged in Marxism to defend what was happening in the Soviet Union. Therefore, the political practice that could be used to defend an alternative was somewhat compromised, to the point that it was difficult to defend what was happening under Stalin's authority in the context of the Soviet Union. In a way, Marxism becomes a positivist theory. Like Walt's thought, it becomes a structural theory, a theory that seeks to understand the working structures of reality, but that will not develop an understanding of political action strategy to effectively intervene in this society. In the context of the Cold War, the theory of international relations influenced by Marxism was born. In this, we have the theory of dependency. It is within the mode of a theory that is not revolutionary. It has political applicability. It influences foreign policies of many countries, but it is not a theory of overcoming capitalism. It is a theory to guide your action in capitalism, how capitalism works and how inequalities work within it. The theory of dependency is fundamentally a critique of the theory of classical liberalism. The way liberalism solved the problem of development was based on the idea of specialization of production. By liberalizing trade, you would allow countries to specialize in certain products because it was easier to specialize in what you produce fast than to produce everything you needed inefficiently. Therefore, you would specialize in what you produce fast and trade with others in global trade. The result for the world economy would be greater, and it would be better for everyone involved if each of the parties chose to specialize in certain products instead of producing everything they needed. Dependency theory seeks to show why, while this idea makes sense, it practically doesn't work. It introduces the concept of deteriorating terms of trade. The idea of classical liberalism does not work because different goods value differently over time in international trade. Goods that have high added value, made with skilled labor and technology implicit in their manufacture, have two characteristics from the point of view of how their prices change. They inflate a lot over time, and they are very stable in their valuation. Primary goods with low added value, little qualified work, and little technology included in their manufacture suffer more seasonality because they are vulnerable to change in climate, for example, and their prices fluctuate a lot. Also, their value increases much more slowly over time. Therefore, there's the idea that if you specialize in primary products, over time you will be more fragile because, for example, any storm can destroy your production. But also, even if none of this happens, your products will appreciate much less compared to other types of products. The point is that the specialization strategy does not increase their independence. It does not generate a global accumulation of prosperity. It increases the degree of dependence of countries that specialize in certain products. Hence the idea of dependency theory. By choosing this strategy of international specialization, you condemn your country to a position of greater dependence on the productive strategies of other countries. Here, what marks the power dynamics of the international system is this relationship between center and periphery, which is another fundamental concept of dependency theory. We have many authors of dependency theory, but we have two concepts that support the debate within that theory. First, we have the idea of the deterioration of the terms of trade, and second, the idea that the configuration of power in the international system is marked by an economic relationship between the center and the periphery of the system. Finally, we have another element that is a theory heavily influenced by dependency theory, which is the world system theory. Dependency theory influences international relations in the 70s debate, but the main concepts are coined in the 50s. In the 70s, we had a transformation related to the transnationalization of the production chain of certain transnational companies in central countries. What was the consequence of this transnationalization? These companies allowed the more peripheral countries with minimally qualified labor capacity to incorporate certain elements of the industry, where they reorganized the entire production value chain so that the industry was no longer responsible for the center of the added value of the making of the product. Intellectual capital remains concentrated in the central countries. This role of intellectual property in the redistribution of the global chain marks the scene of the 70s. For Wallenstein, as a result of this scenario, there was the creation of a new dynamic with the center and the periphery and the semi-periphery. Central countries allow peripheral countries to observe these industries without giving up the predominance of the hierarchical structure in the international system, in which whoever owns the intellectual property remains the center. Thus, even if the structure of the chain changes, the hierarchy of the chain does not change.